Hello there ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this look at the Deadzone version 2 starter box. I'm going to be directly comparing the contents within this box to the version 1 starter to see if we've had an increase in value over the last couple of years. This box does rock in at around about the same price that the previous one did. So let's start off with the size of the box, shall we? You can see here that the previous Deadzone starter was quite a bit longer than the new one. We're going to assume that that means there was more juicy goodness packed into version 1 than version 2, so we'll give a point to version 1 for size. Now let's get to the important stuff, shall we? The actual contents, the guts of the Deadzone version 2 starter. The box crammed full of goodies here, not a huge amount of free space in there. So let's break it down piece by piece, shall we? Starting off with the terrain. One thing that's immediately noticeable as a difference between version 1 and version 2 is that the terrain in version 2 is all much more broken down, dilapidated and crumbled. So there are 3 sprues like this with these rubble pieces. There are 3 sprues like this with the broken up wall sections, some of them a bit more broken up than others. And finally we have this accessory sprue, which is the same as the accessory sprues from version 1, but you get slightly less of them. So as far as the amount of terrain goes, by my calculations, there has been a roughly 20% drop in the amount of terrain you get in the starter box. However, I think the quality of this terrain is superior. The fact that it's much more broken up, it's much more fitting with the overall Deadzone intended aesthetic, I believe. So I'm going to put a point onto version 2 there for the quality and look of the terrain. Next, let's have a look at the miniatures. One thing that will immediately catch your eye is that these miniatures are no longer in restic, they're in hard plastic on a sprue, which of course gives you much more posability with the arms and so on. So version 2 is going to get a point for that. In terms of number of models, there are slightly less in this one, but I'm going to put that down mostly to the fact that it has the Forge Fathers in there rather than the Plague, who are a lower model count faction. So I don't think that's really worthy of an extra point. Upon cracking one of these bad boys open, you can see that there are lots of tiny little accessories on the sprue, which are of course a nice touch for customization. Next, we've got a couple of things that are exactly the same as far as I'm concerned. We've got a bag of dice, we've got a sheet of tokens here, which to my eye looks like marginally less tokens than we had in version 1. But version 2 is a far more streamlined game, so I'm going to assume that is the reasoning there. They are double-sided, of course. Next, now this is definitely a change, these command dice rather than decks of cards, so I'm going to call that about even. They fill pretty much the same role, just in a simpler manner, but as far as quality of box contents, they're pretty even. A set of a few dice or a couple of decks of cards, don't think there's too much difference there. Bases, of course, pretty standard. Now, one area that version 2 definitely excels is the rulebook, which, as you can see, is a nice rigid hardback. So version 2 gets a point for the nice hardback rulebook. I'm not going to give it an extra point for the perceived quality of rules, because of course that's quite subjective. It seems to be fairly unanimous in the community that the rules are better, but this is purely on the physical contents of the box, not the contents of the rules. And finally we get to the mat. So as you can see, the new mat is paper, and I've been unboxing this atop the version 1 lovely smooth mouse mat material, so that's a definite point for version 1 there. For people like me though, who already owned version 1 with the nice mat, I'm glad I'm not paying extra for a starter box for another one, so maybe that was a bit of their thinking in there with version 2, and they do have various other sets that come with mats as well. So overall I would say it's a win for version 2, despite the paper mat. And even for those of us that owned version 1, there is a lot to be had in this box that you could find very useful. Of course, the updated rules and the command dice and such, which can be bought separately, but also the terrain being a different style to the first version, means that if you're already overloaded on the slightly less destroyed terrain, then that's still another reason for you to consider version 2, with the more mangled up terrain pieces, which I'm going to have a lot of fun assembling, of course. They do have a specific pack for people that already own version 1, which just comes with the rulebook and some acrylic tokens rather than the cardboard ones and the command dice. So if you're not interested in either of the factions from the starter, that's probably the way to go. especially if you don't need any more terrain, because I'm sure there are some people out there with a ton of it. But the one thing I'll say about the Deadzone terrain, a small amount of it can get you through a game, but you can never have too much. The crazier the table is, the better as far as I'm concerned, so I just want to get as much terrain as possible and just pile it high all over the board. It is very, very playable with a smaller amount of terrain though. I'm sure that's another thing that's down to personal preference, and maybe the fact that I've been playing as the Plague, who don't like those long firing lanes, and I would rather have view obstructing terrain all over the place so I can walk up unscathed. So I hope this was an informative look at the changes between version 1 and version 2 as far as the box contents. And how about this as a nice juicy piece of bonus content for you? Deadzone Infestation XM4 expansion. And when we pop this open, the first thing you'll see is that it is one of the very lovely mouse mat style battle mats, and it's in a different colour to the original. So having whipped that out first and foremost, you can see 1 or 2 creases which will disappear as I've got it laid out since it's been folded up in the box for a while. The thing with these mouse mat style mats is that any folds or creases do generally completely disappear over the course of a few days once you leave them out. Especially if you're putting terrain down on them, it does flatten them out very well. I've never experienced one of these mats have a permanent crease in it. So we've got the Deadzone Infestation book in here, which as you can tell has a lot of the Vermin stuff in there. They of course being the latest Deadzone faction. There's a bit of juiciness in there regarding all the factions though, and various campaigns and missions that you can do. Here's all the terrain nicely bagged, and again this is very different from the other terrain sets, very different from the original Deadzone, very different from the version 2 starter. This is more of the kind of pipeworks style, so adding this is going to give you a lot of variety in your games. Of course the bag of connectors as well, where would we be without those? I'll tell you where we'd be living in a world where terrain falls apart, and we can't be having that, can we? So there is quite a significant amount of terrain in this box since it's the main feature, and I'm going to be looking forward to mixing and matching that, possibly with the broken up pieces from the starter and a couple of the pieces that I had left over from version 1 as well, making some truly unique terrain. Also, you do get some miniatures in here as well, so let's get a bit of zoom action on this bag, shall we? You get 1 Vermin guy there and 2 of these rather hideous rat swarms, so that's a nice little bonus in there for any of those budding Vermin players out there. So there you have it, a look at the XM4 expansion, Deadzone Infestation, which I've mainly got for the terrain. Because like I was saying, I'm going to try and get as much terrain as possible onto my table. I've also got a lot of ideas for making a completely custom Deadzone board that the terrain pieces would then be able to rest on. But there'll be more on that if I actually get around to it. I have actually ordered a 2 foot by 2 foot piece of wood, which I'm going to be building it onto. So you'll definitely see some videos on that, if and when I get round to it. Anyway, I'm off to clip a lot of terrain off the sprue and get building some of that crazy adult Lego goodness. So, ta-ta for now, folks.